This is ShopTalk, an interview series where I sit down with artists in their studio. We'll talk art, tell stories, and share our thoughts and insights on the art world, and of course, talk shop. Hey everyone, Todd Casey here, sitting down with Jerry Weiss in his studio. So without further ado, here's Jerry Weiss. So Jerry, thanks for having me in your studio. Lovely place you have here. Why don't we start by talking about some of the instructors you had? I know you teach with the Art Students League, but you also have this rich tradition of some of the instructors that I wish I could have studied with. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, thank you, Todd, and welcome to my my humble studio abode.
Thanks.
Are there any teachers you're especially interested in? Because I can go down memory lane and talk about a few people.
Yeah, when I was kind of on my journey and I got the list of like instructors that were I guess I had to study with. One was Harvey Dunn and
Dinnerstein.
Harvey Dinnerstein. Sorry, Harvey Dunn would be great too.
Yeah.
But Harvey Dinnerstein was top of the list. Harvey, I think Burt was on there. Stephen Assel was on there. Max Ginsberg. So a lot of people that are either associated with New York or teaching at the league. So why don't we start with Harvey and tell me a little bit about your experience and how you kind of...
Sure. For a little bit of context, I'll backtrack for a minute or so. The first teacher I studied with outside of high school was a wonderful draftsman, a figure drawing teacher in Miami where I grew up. I lucked out. He was recommended to me by a museum director, Roberto Martinez. Just wonderful. And after a year studying with him, I came up to New York to study at the League. And I didn't know anybody. And I checked into a painting class and I spent a few months in the class and it just wasn't the right fit for me. But I did study most of that first year with Robert Beverly Hale, so I was drawing the figure every day.
Wow, and I love that. Holy crap.
And Hale's lectures were terrific. Hale was a pro. He'd been doing it for decades. And he was congenial and he was intelligent and he knew everything. And I was there long enough to see that he would repeat a lecture. He'd come back a few months later and give the exact same lecture, and he put the jokes in the same places. And he made it seem as natural as hell.
Awesome.
He was just really good at it, and he was terrific. And he, I think, kind of inherited the Bridgman approach of standing in front of the whiteboard with a long stick and charcoal at the end of the stick, and would draw the anatomical diagrams so that 60 or 70 students could huddle around and all watch that. He wouldn't be in the way of the drawing. The second year I was at the League, I tried studying painting again. So I effectively stopped painting in school most of the first year. And then the second year, I started studying with some different teachers. And I studied with Harvey at the National Academy. He wasn't teaching at the League in 1980. 79 or 80 is when I started with Harvey. And it was kind of a coincidence. I lived on the Upper East Side. I lived at the 92nd Street Y, and I think I was walking one day, and I passed the National Academy. I didn't even know it existed. And I saw that Dinnerstein was teaching there, and I heard of him. I knew about him. And I went in, and I just kind of sniffed the place out, and I thought, it's a 5-minute walk from where I was living. So I started taking classes, and I must have studied with Harvey for about a year at the National Academy. And it was really a nice kind of alternative to the League because the academy classes were small. There was a cap on them that kept the enrollment small. I think Harvey only had like 12 or 15 students in the class. And there was a waiting list, and he very kindly looked at my work and jumped me to the top of the waiting list. So I was able to get in after a couple of weeks of waiting. So, and it was really great because I was studying with Harvey in the mornings at the academy, and in the afternoons and evenings, I started studying with Ted Jacobs at the League and Jack Faragasso and Those were the primary painting teachers, and everyone's teaching style was different.
Mhm.
And for me, Harvey's class in the morning was probably where I felt most naturally comfortable.
Mhm.
Harvey kind of really let me explore on my own terms, working from life. And I picked up the things I remember picking up from him that I was kind of most sympathetic to or fondest of, had to do with paint and color, by which I mean they weren't schematic or systematic like some of the things going on at the league were. It was more about Harvey had some catchwords that I really was fond of. One of them was he talked a lot about luminosity and color,
Mm.
and he talked about thick buttery paste and using paint. I have no idea if he still uses those terms when he teaches, but they latched onto my thinking, and I really like the idea of trying to mix up thick buttery paint. And that was kind of a physical process.
Yeah.
And that was an important shift because some of the classes that I was studying in were more invested in illusionism, trying to make things look three-dimensional. And Harvey wasn't selling that, if you will. He was talking more about the painting process, using paint. He even said to me one time when he thought, I guess I was being too careful, he said, you can mix the paint right on the canvas. I was like, ooh. Because here I was trying to mix up everything in advance and then put the right color down. And he was in effect saying, you can just put it right on the canvas and mix it there. Very, very revolutionary.
Yeah. Well, you hear it even today where some artists will say never mix on the canvas, only on the palette. And I get questioned a lot as a teacher, and I'm just like, I don't know anybody who could just mix on the palette and put the piece of paint there and walk away. I don't even think the Impressionists do. They had very much wet into wet techniques or wet over dry, or it just seems like you'd be limiting yourself if you were thinking in one way. So that sounds like it would be revolutionary even now if I said to someone to be like, no, you can totally go back and kind of blend on the canvas or add something over the top.
Yeah. But I think that was good advice to give to a student who was, I guess, reasonably advanced. And he just wanted to make sure that I wasn't getting too precious about it and being too, finicky in my approach. So I really appreciated it. Those are the things that I remember, 40 years later. More than necessarily, more in-depth technical stuff. It was the attitudes and the certain kind of things that kind of opened up the mind a little bit to freed up the thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's important as a teacher too, to kind of free students so that they're not. I think the Joseph Campbell quote would be, "Use the rules, don't be used by the rules." Right.
And even though there was a period, especially when I was 19 and 20, where I was really fond of certain academic precepts and approaches. I didn't feel like I needed to be in an atelier where they were strictly adhered to.
Yeah. And
I went through a little bit of that at that age, but I knew I didn't want to stay with it a long time because to me, painting had to be is more open than that, than finding as we were talking about a little earlier, than adhering to a system.
Yeah.
Than finding this is the system, we're going to stick with it. I always felt like if there's a system here, I'll get what I can from it, but it's not going to stop me from painting freely.
Yeah.
Whatever that looks like.
Well, and it seems like the Art Students League, and probably the National Academy as well. I think a lot of people don't know about it now, but they were both these two institutions that were equally as powerful or important, I guess. And I think from our talking previously is that you enjoyed that fact that, you had a instructor over here that would tell you to do one thing one way and then the other one would almost contradict it. And then the student is faced with the difficult task, of course, of putting it together in the middle and saying, how do I do that?
I think some students get really confused by that.
Yeah.
I've had talks with students along those lines, and I would have Harvey in the morning class saying flat patterns.
Yeah.
And I'd go in the evening or in the late afternoon to the league, and Ted Jacobs would be hitting hard the idea of model the form as quickly as possible.
Right.
And I would get mixed up, and I'd model the form in Harvey's class too soon, and I'd go to Ted's class and I'd work flat patterns. And you know what? It's all good.
Yeah.
It's not as if, oh God, I have to choose one or the other. And the fact is, in my own work, I think I've looked to form, compromise is the wrong word, but I use both approaches.
Yeah. It's interesting. Would you say that when you're a student, you were like thinking one way and now your work is pushed towards a different concept? Or do you think that these two things have always been married together?
It's always been there, because I remember that soon after I left school, I got a handwritten letter from Ted Jacobs when he was in France, and he just set up his school and was trying to cultivate me as a teacher. He wanted me to come over to France and teach there, and I was too young, and I didn't want to teach a system, etc. But I remember in my mind writing him a letter. I don't think I ever actually wrote it and sent it to him, but my explanation being that I was much more invested or much more interested in abstract pattern as and something to me that was dynamic. Right. That I wasn't. It just didn't interest me to get into right at the very beginning, to get into careful modeling of forms.
Right.
You know, so I knew I was built differently from early on.
Yeah.
How that would manifest over time, nobody ever knows.
Yeah.
You know, but I knew that my interests then probably weren't a heck of a lot different from what they are now.
What do you think? When I look at your work, I see. Well, I think your work is gorgeous. First off, but I see like a bit of an influence from like the Impressionists as well. Like the way that you're playing with color. It feels like you're doing perhaps a little bit of the warm light, cool shadow kind of thing. It seems like you're playing more with the paint, where the academic approach is more of like subtle modeling and draw exactly what you see up in front of you. There's a beauty in even your brushstrokes as well. Where do you think that the Impressionists were also part of that too? Because we're in Lime, or Old Lime, or actually your studio is very close to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's also probably a part of the influence as well, even though you did grow up in New York, right?
I grew up in South Florida.
I wasn't even close.
and then came up to New York to study, and stayed in New York for close to 17 years, and then came up to Connecticut when I started teaching in Old Lyme. Your question, there are a lot of different influences.
Yeah.
And some of them run through more academic veins, and some of them are more irreverent or less traditional. And I can probably identify, a number of different ones that some of them are a little bit eclectic. You know? So Impressionism, there are different aspects of Impressionism that have been very important to me for different reasons. As a landscape painter, Monet was always really important to me, especially in the way he could make very rapid shorthand decisions and make them on the canvas in a very exciting way, very lively, more than any particular color rationale or color theory. It was more about his emotional connection to the subject and how it manifested through his approach, through his brushwork, the way he saw. Because that's where we hook into other artists. Right. We're sympathetic to the way they see the world, and that manifests in a whole bunch of different ways. Degas was always exceedingly important to me for different reasons, as a draftsman of the figure and for the way he saw people and the way he composed. So there are two very different artists who were both really important to me. One when I was beginning to paint the figure, and the other when I was beginning to go outside and paint the landscape. That's just from Impressionism. There are other Impressionists I like very much too. And then there's pre-Impressionists like Corot and Daumier, who are equally important to me for different reasons. Yeah. And that's just a little bit of a slice of the French 19th century painting that interests me.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I know that you're very well versed in the historical side of it. You're a writer as well. And I love reading your writing for Artist Magazine, I think right now, and also Watercolor Magazine.
Artist Magazine, and there are two satellite magazines, Watercolor Artist and Pastel Journal. So I'm lucky to write for all three of them.
That's awesome.
And I'm doubly lucky because I get to choose the subject matter.
That's great.
I pick the artists and the paintings, and it's almost always historical.
Yeah.
And then when you go, as you know, when you go into copyright business, I'm almost invariably choosing artists who've been dead for 100 years or more.
Right. Easier to get rights. Even though you did, I was just looking at one of the articles you did, I think for Linear. I think it was Linear magazine, and it was Dean Keller, and you were writing about Bridgman, and I think Keller came up because it's also the connection to Lyme. But Keller would probably be harder to get easy access because you're close to Lyme, rural Lyme. But he passed away in the 90s, was it?
2000 and I think 2005. It was either 2004 or 2005. I know it was January 4th. And it was, I believe it was 2005 that Dean passed away. And he was a friend and a colleague who, as too often happens, I didn't as fully appreciate when I was teaching at the same time and in the same place as I appreciate him now.
Yeah.
Now that I'm older, I get him more.
Yeah, no, he's beautiful. I remember seeing, I think maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago, Artist Magazine, or maybe it was American Artist Magazine at the time, which is no longer around. I think did an article on him, and I was like, this guy must have studied with Bridgman. You could see the constructive anatomy, large sheets. Yeah, but he didn't, right?
He didn't study with Bridgman, but his father did. And Dean Keller Sr. taught at Yale for something like 40 plus years.
Wow.
Through good times and bad times, as I understand, for representational art at Yale. And then Dean, I do believe from my conversations with him that he really idolized his father and probably taught in a similar mode. I'm guessing this. But the influence of Bridgman, the impression of Bridgman was very strong on the Dean Keller who I knew.
Yeah, I love all those old drawings. I haven't seen them in person, but I love the Bridgman ones. I have seen a few of those. I actually bought student work of his by Saul Tepper, and it looks like he drew right on it. I'm almost positive that Bridgman drew on the paper, which I'm sure he did at the time. But there's just a different constructive knowledge that even Robert Beverly Hale, being able to study with him. I remember going to the library in New York City and finding the old lectures they had, VHSs, and watching them, and they were so poor quality, but the information of those lectures, and Bridgman was doing the same. I think packed rooms at the League for a couple hours of an anatomy session, and then they would focus on like rib cage, torso, or structure of the pelvis or something like that.
That's right. And my familial connection to Bridgman was that my parents met in his class.
Awesome.
My father was a cartoonist who was already working professionally, but he returned because he felt he needed to learn how to draw the figure better. So he spent a few months in Bridgman's class, and my mother was less enthusiastic about studying with Bridgman because he did work on students' drawings, and she didn't like that. So I have a few drawings that they both did when they were in his class, and one of them, my mother wrote underneath the drawing, "Bridgman did this," so we'd know what was hers and what was his.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that brings us to illustration too, which I think we have a big overlap for love for it. And your dad, as you mentioned, was a professional cartoonist. Is that correct? And the collection that you had, I think, because your dad's connection to either all these people or perhaps Society of Illustrators. You want to tell me a little bit about that?
My dad was a really enthusiastic collector before American illustration was acknowledged as an art form or really appreciated at all. He wanted to be an illustrator, but he ended up doing cartooning. His idol was James Montgomery Flagg, who he met when my dad was 19, and Flagg drew his portrait. He met Flagg a couple of times at his studio. What my father started to do at the age of 19 was go around New York City and meet as many illustrators and cartoonists as he could, as he admired. And most of them gave him artwork because they were just tossing them out. The magazines that used them threw them out. And when artists did keep them, there was no market for them. So many times my father's collection started with gifts from illustrators and cartoonists. And my dad was clearly very charming and very outgoing when he was 19. Later on, when he started to make a living as a cartoonist, he started to buy illustration.
Yeah.
And when I say buy, I mean buy really good stuff for $25 and $50 a pop back in the 1930s and 40s. He bought a Norman Rockwell post cover from Rockwell. I think it was 1949, if I remember my ancient history.
Wow.
He bought it for $150 from Rockwell.
Wow.
But he wasn't just interested in Rockwell. Yeah. I mean, he met Harvey Dunn and he bought 2 or 3 paintings from Dunn. Mm-hmm. He had James Montgomery Flaggs. He had Charles Dana Gibson. He had basically a kind of honor roll of American illustrators. Norman Price, later on Edwin Austin Abbey, and Dean Cornwell, who became my favorite. In fact, I was a teenager when my dad started collecting Cornwell, and I would act as an informal advisor. He would show me a photograph of a painting that was available from a New York gallery or Philadelphia gallery, and he'd say, "What do you think of this?" And I'd usually say, "You have to buy that."
Yeah, that's awesome.
And I'm just scratching the surface. A lot of J.C. Leyendeckers.
Yeah, wow. So how did all this artwork influence you? Because I know you said you had it on the walls, and
I think some of it must have influenced me terrifically. But by the time I was 14 or 15, I reached that wonderful tender age when you're trying to strike out on your own and form your own persona. And part of that meant I really took very little of the illustration seriously. Mm-hmm. I found fault with all of it. Mm. And the primary thing I found fault with was that these were men and women who were drawing and painting commercially. And I just couldn't abide by that.
Yeah.
Because what was important to me was maintaining personal vision, not doing an illustration for somebody else's idea.
Expressing yourself.
And so most of the illustrators kind of, after a while, I had the complete blasé quality of, I grew up around this crap. Yeah. Like, yeah, so what? It was like I was really spoiled in a way. Here it was all around me from the time I was a boy. The big Leyendecker post cover hanging over my bed and this and that. The Cornwells I felt differently about. I really did connect with the Cornwells more because to me they were more painterly.
You had one of the ones that I'm going to be putting in my book, which is so funny that it's kind of, I guess, come around, which is the couple, I think, sitting on the sofa with the man with his head down and the woman. It's all green, and I mean, you would see this daily, but I've only seen it in reproductions. I think the Kelly collection owns it now.
Yes, and I think probably they bought it from my father. A long time ago. And probably what resonated with me about Cornwell were the artistic elements was that he really painted well and juicily. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about his work in the early 1920s.
Yeah.
He was confident and he just made it look really, really good.
Yeah, that was before he studied, I think, with Brangwyn, right? And then he studied a little bit with, I think, Nikolai Fechin when Fechin finally came over.
Yes.
But that period is my favorite Cornwell as well, the 20s and 30s into the 40s. And then it became a little more flatter.
It becomes more mechanical, I think.
Yeah. Outlined. I think he was trying to be a muralist.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it goes in a different direction, which happens with most of us.
Right.
But that period, I think, is really interesting. I think also there's a Harvey Dunn quality to the early paintings.
Yeah. Well, the quote, I think, was that he was Harvey before he was done. So I think he was flying a little too close to the sun, where he was looking just like Harvey Dunn at the time because he had studied with him. Mm-hmm. And then I think somebody had to have a conversation with him to say, maybe you want to paint it or take it somewhere else.
But I think another aspect of what I liked about him without even fully comprehending it is that he was often painting his subjects in a kind of, I don't want to put too much baggage on his work, but there was a kind of emotional content to his figures, a kind of cloudy content that it wasn't like Hayden Sundblom or Andrew Loomis, where everything was kind of calendar perfect,
right,
and everybody was kind of smiling and happy, and Santa Clauses. Cornwell's figures looked, as often as not, they looked miserable.
Yeah.
And he got away with that. He not only got away with it, he was paid at his height $100,000 a year,
Wow.
I think, by Hearst, just to keep turning out illustrations. So somehow he got away with this kind of these strange subjects of these very kind of ambiguous and often distant people. You know, men and women, when they were in the same room, like in that painting you're referring to, they're not really connecting with one another.
Yeah.
They're kind of looking off in different directions, and neither of them look very happy. And I think there was something about that intrigued me.
I think he has that in a lot of his work too, a feeling of separation, where the two figures, they're not even looking at each other, but there's like an awkwardness to it. So Cornwell was actually referred to as the dean of illustrators. So before Rockwell was big, Cornwell was kind of like the guy, right?
I would think it was kind of Cornwell and Leyendecker.
Yeah.
And then before them, Gibson, who didn't work in oil, but was pen and ink.
Yeah.
And also pen and ink. Flagg was very big.
They were all New York artists too, right? Up in like either New Rochelle or...
Flagg had a New York studio. Cornwell, I don't remember if Cornwell was in New York. I think Cornwell had a New York studio, yeah.
Yeah, I think he was.
And Leyendecker did move to New Rochelle.
Yeah, and I know that the story of like in My Adventures as an Illustrator by Rockwell is that he moved up there to kind of, I don't know, stalk or because he emulated Leyendecker. And before Leyendecker, I think that's actually what's similar about the Harvey Dunn Cornwell thing is that Rockwell was almost flying a little too close to the sun there too. When you look at some of those early works by Rockwell, I went up to the Rockwell Museum. I'm sure you've been there a bunch. Have you been yet? Oh man, it's worth it.
Like I said, I keep a lot of the old illustration at arm's length.
That's true. But so if you go up there, I saw one of those old shows, and you could see his early work, and I was like, that's a Rockwell. Wow. So I think it's common for students to do that too. So as a teacher, do you see that a lot, where a student will try to get some of the concepts that you're teaching, and then their artwork starts to look like yours? Is that helping much?
I think the reason I'm hesitating on that is because I don't think I'm usually conscious of it. So in a way, part of what I'm saying is I'm not trying to cultivate that.
Yeah.
I'm not expecting or consciously desiring students to work like me.
Right.
It's always a touchy thing, as a teacher, because subconsciously we respond if somebody is listening to us and beginning to paint like us.
Right.
It confirms what we're doing.
Right. It seems like they're getting it.
But you got to be really careful about that, because there's also something very, very weird about cultivating a bunch of mini-me's. So I don't think I see it often. At least I'm not aware of it.
Yeah.
And if it does happen and I do become aware of it, it depends on what level the student is at. But if they're working at a high level, regardless of whether they're working like me or not, I like to kind of encourage them to go elsewhere.
Yeah.
Not to get too comfortable in one class.
Kick them out of the bird's nest.
Yeah. It's hardest to do that if the student is also a good monitor who's been with you for a long time, because they become kind of irreplaceable.
Yeah.
Not only are they doing good work, but they're running the class for you.
I think that's actually an ode to that way of thinking too, of like, you should have more than one teacher, and you shouldn't look to be just being part two of that person. I see that way too much right now with contemporary work, where people are looking to be part two of the person. They paint the same exact thing. They get the technique down, and then their artwork is the same subject matter and everything. And it baffles me that, almost like as kids, when we come into art, we have nothing thrown on us at that time, and it's just whatever is of your interest. And then sometimes when we go into schools, we actually narrow our focus, and we're taught what is supposed to be good and bad, rather than sounds like you're a man of integrity, of like keeping the honesty of your interests in the things that you want to do.
Teachers I liked, I generally didn't stay with for more than a year because I didn't want to, and it was inevitable when I was studying with certain teachers that it was inevitable that superficial characteristics would get into my painting.
Right.
That other students knew who I was studying with because you could tell from the style.
Yeah.
But I didn't stay with this wonderful drawing teacher, Roberto, in Miami for more than a year.
Mm-hmm.
I left that to go to New York. I didn't stay with Harvey for more than a year.
Mm-hmm.
After I left school, I came back for half a year or so just to study with Mary Beth McKenzie the first year she taught, because I was interested. I had known of her work beforehand.
Yeah.
Harvey had actually introduced me to her work when I was studying with her, and I respected her a great deal. So I was curious to study with her for a few months, and I did come back to school just to be around her. In retrospect, I don't know if it's fortunate or not, it's just the way it was. I didn't really go to study with teachers in order to emulate their way of doing it, or in order to get direction. I was really self-directed. Mm-hmm. And I was going to teachers to learn a little from this person, from that way of thinking, right, and integrate it into what I already kind of had a sense of what interested me. Mm-hmm. So that's not to say a lot of students, I suspect, go to school with the idea of, I'm going to do 2 or 3 years of this rigor. Mm-hmm. It's like, I have to draw the model. I've got to study this or that, and then I can do my own thing. I really enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. Whoever I was studying with, it was always interesting to me. Mm-hmm. But I also knew that it wasn't, there was something more out there, that I had to do my own thing.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's best. It's almost like where a lot of, even in writing, you hear it, where Robert Frost, the famous poem, I took the road less traveled by, and that made all the difference. You have to go into the forest at your own path, and you know when you've had enough. At least I know I did, training. And then you're just kind of like, I always had this urge to be like, okay, I just need to dump it all out, but I can't listen to somebody else telling me what to do anymore. I need to figure it out, which I think is what I'm trying to say with all the writers too. They're saying you need to be the one to figure out the last step. And that's the hardest of them, to put it all together, but find you at the same time. So you're not stuck waiting to find out what to paint, almost, in a sense.
I always tell students that when I left school more or less at 21, and then as I said, I came back at 23 to study with Mary Beth for a little bit. But when I left school at 21, it wasn't because I learned everything I needed to learn. It was because I got tired of painting setups that other people were setting up and sharing the model with 30 other students. Yeah. And when you say, all right, I have to work on my own, you're opening up something much more difficult. And I'm not speaking about just the concepts, because my concept was very simple. Just draw and paint people. Yeah. Sit them down and draw and paint them. In the same kind of conversational way that you and I are talking now. That's how painting would look to me. Yeah. To have that kind of ebb and flow working with a model. What was difficult was the practicality of getting the models and figuring out, where am I going to work? That's why I started doing more landscape painting, because I could just drive around and find the model. Yeah. Free models. But that was really, and continues to be in a way, the most challenging aspect. When you're in school, it's provided for you. Right. Not only do you have the teacher coming around, but I think there are students who just come to class because it's a model and it's much more affordable than hiring your own. Right. But it also keeps you locked in to that school mindset. Right. Yeah, no, I think that's an important thing to bring up. So where do you see yourself today with all this,
you had Harvey, you had Tetzet Jacobs, you were inspired by the Impressionists. I'm sure you're continually inspired. I know you and I, first time we met up, went into the Florence Griswold Museum together. I'm always continually looking. I'm sure you are too. So where are you with your work today, and where do you see it going? And I hope that's not too deep.
Oh, it's not too deep. It's just that
It's too broad.
it's just that I'm not sure I know how to answer it.
So I guess where are you? Where are you with it all?
I think probably if I'm going to lean on somebody else's description of the process, it would be what Degas said, and that is an artist finds one little spot in the backyard
Mm-hmm.
to set up camp and continues to dig in that one place.
Mm.
And I think there's some irony in Degas saying it because as a technical artist, he was extremely experimental.
Mm.
Even if his subject matter and his interests were, I was going to say rather narrow, but they weren't that narrow.
Yeah.
He kind of took in aspects of all of Paris with his work. So probably I'm doing a variation on that, which is I've not with any preconceived notion, but seem to be sticking closely to a few different ideas and reworking them again and again. And if you come at your work out of habit, or if you do it by rote, or if you have the misfortune of being financially successful,
Mm-hmm.
then you can repeat yourself without and kind of descend over the years. You keep repeating the same theme, and the life begins to go out of it because you've done it hundreds of times and it becomes dull.
Right.
If, on the other hand, you continue coming back to a similar idea over and over again because you're constantly refreshed by it,
Mm.
and you find it interesting, and you find variations on a theme. Probably the most popular example when you talk about that is people drag out the fellow who did all the bottles, Morandi.
Mm-hmm.
Morandi doing the same still life essentially for 30 or 40 years. If you come back to it and you're constantly interested, then you can do it for several lifetimes.
Yeah.
So I think I'm probably doing variations on the theme of the figure in the interior, the portrait in the interior, the landscape,
Mm-hmm.
the New England landscape, because that's where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of me that would love to travel, that would love to paint the Rockies, would
Mm-hmm.
love to go to different places and find different dramatic scenery.
Mm.
If I could, I'd always like the idea of painting more compositions with multiple figures in the studio.
Mm.
So anytime I can get a couple sitting for me, whether it's a married couple or friends who will pose for me, that always kind of lights a different fire.
Mm.
There's a difference from doing this, the figure, the solitary figure, which has its own particular intensity,
Mm-hmm.
and then the interaction between two figures, between two models, which I find fascinating. And in a way, it kind of loosens me up because then I can play more as a painter with more shapes and more activity.
Yeah.
So, in other words, I don't see any kind of surprising departure.
Mm.
I don't think tomorrow I'm going to start doing steel wool paintings of imaginary animals, if you will, or do something conceptual. Knowing me, I'll be sticking closely to what I continue to enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And there's nothing ideological. I'm not trying to sell a philosophy in doing it. That's important to say too. So in a way, I've always had the luxury of doing what I wanted to do because it interests me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to sell realism to the world, a particular type of realism, a particular theory. It's just leave me alone and let me do my thing kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's an element of that that's clearly self-indulgent.
Yeah.
And if you're fortunate enough as an artist to do it, terrific.
I think art always is, to a degree, some kind of self-indulgence. Right? I mean, we're creating it, and especially, I would say, in the 20th century or 21st century, we have the ability to paint whatever we want to. So in that sense, it's not like we're Rockwell or Cornwell or even Michelangelo waiting for the Pope to ask us or wait for the next commission to come along, or even Rembrandt had a bunch of them too. But in that sense, it's kind of like it seems like that's where a lot of realistic art went in the 21st century, is self-expression, something like the Art Spirit, which is a fantastic book, talks about things like that, like doing it for yourself. It's almost like the idea that the artist must be broke and kind of live for their art, the romantic side of it.
Starving artist.
Yeah, the starving artist seems like it came around around the 19th, late 19th century and 20th century.
Probably.
Yeah.
Very romantic idea. I think it's interesting that these two kind of dichotomies are playing out right now in these two different, very impressive shows at the Met.
Mm.
You have, on the one hand, you have this wonderful show of Florentine Portraiture, Mannerist's work, Pontormo and Bronzino, and it's all commissioned work. It was all work that they were doing; they were getting paid for it. So, in other words, it's the kind of work that it's like that I've mostly successfully navigated staying away from.
Right.
Aside from the occasional portrait commission, which I love doing.
Yeah.
But for the most part, but here you have these works, and they're clearly, the best of them, they're clearly inspired.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any difference to us whether they were doing it because they were getting paid for it. They're just inspired compositions and stylizations that people like Bronzino and Pontormo were finding using their own voices. And then in another part of the museum, you've got Alice Neal, who in a different respect is quintessential 20th century, what you're describing.
Mm.
She was very much her own artist and was painting people most of her life, aside from the occasional commission or famous person who sat for her once she became well known. Most of them are of people that nobody else was paying attention to her painting. Mm. People of color, women, who weren't well known, who weren't famous, neighborhood people. And this is what fascinated her. Mm. And so, not meaning to bring this back to me, but in different aspects of my work, I borrow from both traditions, if you will, from the iconoclastic as well as the kind of traditional, for lack of a better word, commercial portraiture.
Yeah.
You know? And it's not like I spend time thinking about how do I reconcile these two different things. You just do what you do. Yeah,
no, for sure. And I think Degas is also a great example, as you said, just like Cornwell is, I think, because Degas' work is, if you see it, he's considered an impressionist. But oddly, when you look at his early work, it's not impressionistic at all.
He's not an impressionist in the same way that Monet and Sisley and Pissarro are impressionists.
Yeah.
He was never about, and he made fun of the whole idea of going outside and setting up your easel and painting, changing light effects. You know, he said painting is not a sport. Yeah. Something you do in the studio. It's an artifice. It's a contrivance. And Degas started out, he's been described, I think rightly, as the best among all the later 19th century painters, the most thorough student of the Italian Renaissance. Yeah. He studied and he copied and he really understood what came before him. Not only the Italian Renaissance, but the Dutch masters and the Flemish masters. Yeah. He knew them well.
Oh, history.
And that's where he came from. And what a strange and marvelous point in history where that was his training. Yeah. And yet he was there, he had a front row seat to the genesis of Impressionism. So some of that did end up integrating into his own approach, especially as he began to lose his eyesight.
Right. I think most people associate his work as the dancers and the sculptural dancer as well. But to me, when I go to the Met, I'm captivated by that room of those small little portraitures that he did. The same room that has, I forget the artist, but they're like small little head studies in there. And they're just absolutely gorgeous. Actually, the Gardner Museum has one as well, and that's what it is. I think it's there's a guy kind of leaning over, and he's got all these postcards, and right behind him is like a portfolio that's open.
Mm-hmm.
And it just is not what we know Degas of the room with the Impressionists, of the dancers, which there's that room at the Met too. And I think it's fascinating because, again, in the same way you see this evolution of an artist kind of changing, but being interested in just what's going on.
Well, early Degas and late Degas are two different persons.
Yeah. Also because he was, as you said, he was
losing his eyesight, and any number of things that happen to an artist as they age.
Yeah.
But old Degas wasn't possible without young Degas.
Right.
Because he knew his stuff so very well. He knew the traditional aspects. And again, as I was saying earlier, he didn't know them because it was a rigor. It's like, I have to do this. I think at some fundamental level, he absolutely loved what he was studying as a student.
Yeah.
He was absorbed by the museums, and he was absorbed by what came before him. And then he obviously uses that as a platform for his own voice, which was always there.
Yeah.
You know, again, there's this misconception among students that I'll have my own voice later on, but it's always underneath there if you're aware of it.
Absolutely.
Even if you're not aware of it. But you said something else a moment ago too that I wanted to riff on, and now I can't remember what it was.
Oh, that's all right. I think he was the son of a banker, so he actually came from money. And there's also this interesting dichotomy of that from reading about Degas, that he had this weird relationship, I think, with his wife, where she looks so unhappy in the paintings.
Not his wife. He never married.
Oh, okay. Is it his mistress?
No.
Well,
we know nothing of Degas' personal life.
Oh, interesting.
As far as we don't have clear evidence that he was ever with anybody.
Interesting. There's a woman that looks extremely unhappy in the painting that he did of her.
That's more than likely.
And I think it was like she was pregnant, and I think he was in it, and perhaps the father doesn't help that I don't remember the name of the painting.
Oh, probably the Bolelli family.
Yeah, she's on the left.
The mother and the two girls.
Yeah,
and the father is separated.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's a novel.
Yeah.
That's a novel like Sargent's painting of the Boy Children.
Hmm.
We know a lot about what Degas was painting. That was his aunt.
Oh, okay, I wasn't even close.
And her children, and her husband, and they were a very unhappy marriage.
Mm.
And so we know a lot about that family dynamic. And Degas stayed with them for a few months at their home in Italy.
Okay.
And then, the best as we can reconstruct it, he did a lot of small sketches, drawings, pastels
Yeah.
there.
I remember the portrait he did of.
And then painted the big thing, probably when he got back to Paris and he rented a studio just to paint that picture.
He has a lot of that too in his work, where there's like a sadness or sad quality with the figures. I know the Museum of Fine Arts Boston had a very blue painting and a figure off on the right, and the woman just kind of very sadly looking. Obviously striking and beautiful at the same time. But yeah, I think, a lot of those artists, their work is very, very deep, deeper than we think. And we think of the Impressionists as just going out and doing these things.
Oh, I know. When you mention that most people think of Degas just ballet dancers, that's kind of like taking Leonardo, and people who are lay people don't go any deeper than this and think Mona Lisa and that's it. And you miss, 15 different levels of Leonardo's genius if you identify an artist with one picture or one subject.
Even at the Louvre. Like, I remember at the Louvre, I went to go see the Mona Lisa because I'm like, where is it? It's obviously under glass. So you can see the line forming. But as I was trying to get to it, I was like, I just passed like 5 Leonardo da Vinci's on the way, and they're all gorgeous. So I had to like stop. And then by the time I got to the line, it was so long I didn't even wait. And it was under like 6 inches of glass, and you couldn't even get that close. It's crazy.
People are very suggestible.
Yeah.
If you tell them something is important, and they all go to that, it becomes a fad.
Well, it's a form of priming, right, in psychology. That if you say, like, go, I think we see it at the Met a lot with Madame X, where everybody wants to go see that because that's the one John Singer Sargent painting that you have to see.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also, like, the Sunflowers by Van Gogh and the Cathedrals by Monet. And that's it. You can leave.
Right.
But there's so much more in the Met that could lead you to many new artists that you probably never heard of.
The context for each painter is fascinating. It's not just the paintings that we might latch onto because they're famous, but it's the context of where they came from, and how the artist got there. It's fascinating, and that's what's fascinating for me about writing about it. So it's not just the drawing of the painting itself. It's what was the culture like that was committed during. How did that come to be? We don't generally ask that when we look at a painting. When we look at a great painting, we just kind of take it for granted. It's like, oh, it always existed.
Right.
And we don't think about how did that come to being? How did the artist envision it?
Yeah, and I think the Impressionists were actually probably not the first, but putting almost like art and ideology, a lot of things happening at the time historically were in their paintings with the increase in colors that they were using because of the French Industrial Revolution, where they were starting to switch over from, some colors into new ones. And then the ferrule was developed on the paintbrush, and you even see hats, like bucket hats, because they're starting to go out. And Monet was out painting with Boudin, was it? And plein air painting was starting to become its own thing, which was an aspect of French academic. And even like the standing French easel that we use, I think was around that time. So you see a lot of cool technology at the time. And then that's also another reason why they were going outside, because they had all the tools. Pigments weren't in paint bladders anymore. They finally were in metal tubes, and you can actually be portable with it. So it's always fascinating to me. I actually took a class in grad school for art and ideology, which we were taking philosophical movements and putting them in with art at the time. And you could see that there was always a play between them. And I think a lot of even the French Academy had a lot of science that they were intertwining with Michel Chevreul and like these new scientific ways of thinking about color at the time. And I think art should be taught that way, and so that we know kind of historically what's happening at the time. World War II is coming, and there's a bond drive, and that's when we see a lot of these, like I think Landecker and Rockwell doing these posters in Cornwall as well. And it becomes, I think, a bit more noble even to do them if you're going to be doing posters for, a bond drive for a world war or the second one.
I think a lot of students miss that context and don't dig deeply enough.
Yeah.
That they see the image, and that's all.
Yeah.
And it in a way, it takes something that was done maybe in the 16th century, and we judge it by our current 21st century taste. And you really, it gets much more interesting when you just do a little bit of digging.
Yeah.
Because one of the things it does, it opens us up as painters to work that doesn't initially appeal to us.
Yeah.
Once we do a little bit of study and begin to understand the culture and the time that a painting came out of.
Right.
And it opens up our appreciation. It doesn't mean I'm going to like Poussin as much as I like Hals.
Yep.
Because my own innate tastes are going to stay pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
But it means I'm going to be able to appreciate things I hadn't before,
right.
and realize that it's just as good as what I like.
Yeah.
It might not be what I want to do, and I think that's very important. Otherwise, I think so many young painters, it's like they're Sargent and they compare everything else to Sargent.
Yeah.
And you're only as good as you're close to Sargent as a painter.
Yeah.
And that becomes, you used the word earlier today before, myopic.
Yeah.
It becomes a very myopic way of looking at painting. My standard, for me when I was younger, was Degas. Right. And you're only as good as you are close to Degas in drawing and in sentiment. And that's a really, either way, it's kind of a bizarre.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the kind of impressionistic way to look at it would be Monet or Sargent. And then the academic would be like Bouguereau. Like I just hear this overly love for Bouguereau. And to me, it's probably the biggest yawn fest art. Beyond the technical side of it, is then when I go, it's pretty boring. I've always found it pretty boring. Not all of it.
I do too. And I realize that in traditional circles, that's heresy now, because he's become, I think there are certain traditional 19th century painters who've just, in the last 30 and 40 years, have really ascended,
Yeah.
who've gone up a lot. And it's pulled good painters and second-rate painters alike up as the water's risen, as the level's risen. And I think a lot of it as being subliminally related to cultural issues and financial issues.
Yeah.
When Bouguereau was painting, there was criticism of him, I think very, very accurate criticism, that his was the painting for oak-paneled men's private salons kind of thing.
Right.
And I think that's the kind of thing that resonates too. I think there's something very, if you will, kind of culturally conservative about it,
Right.
that people long for.
Yeah.
There's a sentimental aspect, but I also think part of Sargent's popularity has been the implicit sense of financial success.
Yeah.
People he's painting and the way he's painting plays to a sense of immense wealth and immense respectability.
Right.
And people, I think, are very attracted to that. And insofar as people gravitate towards that, I tend to go the other direction.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Because while acknowledging Sargent's high level, while acknowledging how good he was, it's the other parts that I think people are attracted to that I find suspect.
Yeah, I think he also has that romantic aspect as well, which is that he never married, he didn't have kids, right? And that he painted for himself. Well, not so much always for himself. He did a lot of course, portraiture.
Which he said he abhorred.
Yeah, but then he eventually probably got enough money where he could just do whatever he wanted to. And that seems very romantic, where you get to that point where you can just, he went out apparently and studied with, or I don't know if he studied with or sat at the feet of Monet and said, show me what you're doing, because it's beautiful. And one of the things that Monet said at the time, I think, was he wanted to use his palette. And he said, where's your black? He was like, I don't have black.
Right.
He's mixing his own. So
right.
Fascinating. But yeah, I think he's like one of the most romantic painters that we can think of out there. So one of the things also, I didn't realize you had such a love for Degas. I absolutely love Degas too. His earlier work, I don't mind the dancers and all that stuff too. But I also love that I think you posted something about how you were inspired by Degas and did a version of his painting. You and I had a quick dialogue about it. Because what I find these days is that sometimes an artist will find an old painting, and it used to happen pre-internet a lot more, I think, where you would find a painting not really inspired by, but they would actually take and do their version of it. And you see elements of it throughout art history, almost like an ode to somebody. But in the way that you showed it was more of like, here's how I was inspired by it, but it doesn't look like the painting. And I think that's the correct way to do it, because the other way to do it, I think, is flying way too close to the sun. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Never my interest to emulate another painter, but rather to let my, if you will, my sympathetic way of seeing, to allow that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'll go to Degas for this great quote. Supposedly the first time he saw one of Mary Cassatt's works, he said, "There is someone who thinks as I do." Yeah. And I think that's what happens with artists. We kind of stand up when we see a work and we say, "Oh, yeah, oh, absolutely." So I felt that way for a long time about Degas' figure and portrait work. I identified strongly with much of it. And I felt that way about Raphael Sawyer's work. It's a New York figurative painter. And it's never a question of trying to copy them, but it's more of, especially when I was young, asking myself, what would they do in this situation if I'm struggling with a painting? It's more about the kind of feeling or the way of seeing that makes an impact. It's like, yes, I understand that, and it's similar to the road that I'm interested in traveling. Yeah. Never, I want to travel the same road.
Yeah, I always feel like some artists will see it as a blueprint, and if I change the objects out of it and put my objects in, then it becomes my painting. And it just seems like you've taken the idea of putting a picture together out of it it's Cornwell actually had a great quote where he said, "Be inspired by the ideals of the masters. Don't do versions of the
That's
paintings."
terrific.
Yeah, and I think I see it quite too often, and I think it's almost like when you hear like a song, like a hip hop song, and you go, "That's David Bowie," that you just copied, and now you're rapping over it, right? And the new generation may not know who David Bowie is. But for those who know who David Bowie is, you're just like, what's the garbage over that beautiful song that David Bowie did? And it's fascinating because once you come around later, I don't think everybody would have this reaction, but once you come around later and you realize, wait, David Bowie made the song. They just took the lyrics and then did rap over it. Then you kind of lose the love for it a little bit. At least I did, growing up with hip hop. But
Well, then you get into this whole appropriation business, which is another interesting and controversial topic about when is an artist copying, when are they just appropriating.
you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, starting with the Degas you brought up earlier, there was in particular this head that he did of a young woman, of a girl, which I saw in a book when I was a teenager, when I was starting to paint, probably 12 or so. I first noticed it, and it lodged. And it's still there. And when I revisit the image of that painting, I appreciate it more fully now than when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But it's no less miraculous to me.
Yeah.
And I've probably done one or two paintings where that was in the back of my mind. Not only did I want to copy it, I'm incapable of copying it.
Yeah.
I couldn't if I wanted to. I can't paint like that. But it serves as inspiration.
Yeah.
Not only technically, but emotionally for what's unspoken, for what's inside that picture. And it's interesting to me that Bert Silverman has actually written about the very same painting, about the same Degas, and that he gets that kind of very profound read, that very profound influence from it as well. Appropriation is that's a loaded word.
Yeah.
And it comes up a lot in art, in music, and in visual art. I think that there are artists who traffic in it, who like being provocateurs, and who like appropriating big chunks of another artist's work and then adding their own to it. I think if you're not a very good artist, it just looks like theft.
Yeah.
You know, it looks like you're trying to ride on the back of somebody more famous. If you're a good artist and you're sampling, then it's more complicated.
Yeah, I think one of the quotes that one of my mentors told me back in the day, and you have a ton of good quotes. One of these days we'll get into a bunch of them because I've been pondering the last one you told me, which is to paint in verbs and not in nouns, which I find fascinating.
Woodbury.
Is it Woodbury?
Yeah, Woodbury. He told the students that. Gertrude Fisk remembered him saying that.
I Googled it, and Elaine de Kooning came up too.
Really?
Yeah, and it's something similar, but it's not exactly the same. But I think it's fascinating because I think it reminds me of kind of like what Cornwell and those guys were doing at that time, which is right before the action is the moment that you're trying to get the suspense of the audience and then paint that picture. When I do my still life paintings, I try to talk about that too, kind of implying that perhaps somebody was there or just walked out of the scene. It's very, to me, the Ralph Lauren aspect, which is tell a story, but make it interesting and engage the audience in that sense. Like if you're going to put a knife in there, put a sliced lemon, and then it shows that somebody just cut it open. You walked into the scene. Or a martini painting with, some fruit that's cut up right about to go into the glass. Yeah, I'm going to find that quote. I'll remember it.
Mm-hmm.
So who are some of the other artists that also you're inspired by? I know we've talked about like you and Uglo and Lucian Freud. Do you have I'm sure this list is always changing as well.
It was fun when I was in school because the list was changing week to week because you discover new people when you're 20, and now it's pretty much, nobody new from the past. I know everybody from the past.
Yeah.
There are contemporary artists who pop up on the screen who you find interesting. I present Uglo and Freud as being kind of a continuation of the romantic versus neoclassical dichotomy that's been going on for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
To my mind, two of the best figurative painters out of England from the late 20th century, and they represent two completely different, the hot and the cool schools, if you will.
Well, that's also where you're talking about like a lot of difference between the two, but also somebody should dig in to find out what those were,
right?
Of like where they're coming at from their art, and it becomes even more fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, it starts just with picking up a monograph and seeing the work when an artist was young, and then watching the evolution.
Yeah.
And then if you're interested, you dig a little bit deeper and you read about it. If you get too deep, you start reading about the personal life, and we don't always need to know about that.
Yeah.
We think we need to know about it to flesh out the work more. But the truth is, I rather admire the artists who said, people like Klimt and I forget who else said it, saying, you don't need to know anything about me. It's all in my work.
Yeah.
Hiding behind the work is
That's great.
A lot of artists. I mean, my interest goes back to the Renaissance, to particular draftsmen and painters of the Renaissance, and runs through the Dutch and the Flemish, particular artists from the Rembrandt from the Dutch Golden Age. Michelangelo was probably the first old master that I was looking at, to go back to the Italian Renaissance, the way he drew. I was looking at before I was painting. And then Rembrandt, and kind of going through this imaginary timeline into the 19th century.
I get the Baroque.
The Baroque, but the Baroque never interested me temperamentally. When we talk about Rubens, Van Dyck interests me temperamentally a little bit more than Rubens. But I know he's not as great a painter as Rubens was. And then I get stuck in the 19th century, because there's so much in the 19th century that fascinates me. The thing is, you can't get stuck in it and think to yourself, that's where art stopped. Great, I'm fascinated with aspects of the 19th century, and I'm inspired by different artists and different periods of painting in the 19th century. But I don't stop there. I use that as inspiration. Great, but I'm painting in the 21st century. And that's that.
We would be missing out on, I think, a whole 80, 90 years of interesting art that was made. It can still be pulled from indirectly, and I think that's kind of what you're saying with the way that you're inspired to. It's not so much that you go, I like Mark Rothko, and I do these red backgrounds, and you can see the clear inspiration. It's more of, well, that's what I wanted to say. That was the quote. I think it was John Lennon, not the dictator. It said, "A professional steal and amateurs imitate."
Right.
It's like you want it to kind of seep into your work, but you don't want to be so clear that you have to say, that's Mark Rothko in the background. I like Rothko. Do you get it? I like Rothko. So I think that's where I would even say, like, I do love Rothko.
And I think if you're asking me to come back to your question before about my work, I think one of the threads that's always been there about what I paint and the way I paint is that there are these different observations and influences at play. But as with my subject matter, everything is subliminal. I'm not trying to put on the surface, look, I'm painting a la this person. Or look, I'm telling this story. I want everything to be ambiguous, if you will. The way I approach painting is very unambiguous. The way I'm drawing and painting and setting up things. But there's nothing in the painting that gives you a roadmap to, this is what I want you to think. I'm not telling the viewer, this is how you should believe in something. What I'm doing is I'm giving my observations of what interests me, period. And then people build whatever they want to build around that.
People will, even if you did tell them, like, look here anyway.
God, they will. And sometimes if you're a control freak, well, that drives you nuts, because people will see stories that have nothing to do with what I was painting. And unfortunately, you have very, very, or more accurately, no control over that.
Cool. Well, it's been awesome chatting with you. For the audience, you teach at the Art Students League, right? You also teach online. I think they're doing Zoom classes.
And God, it was so good having you here.
Yeah, great chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time.
What a pleasure.